All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Building Accessibility to Address Cognitive Impairments. I'm Natalie DeHart with IAAP. Everyone should either be logged into Adobe Connect or you can follow along with the presentation handout provided and you can listen over the phone. During today's webinar, if you'd like to ask questions, our speakers do plan to stop just a couple of times throughout the webinar. If there is time at the end of the webinar, we will also answer some questions then. If you do have questions, please use the chat window that everyone should be seeing. Type it into the box, and we'll get those answered. To guard against background noise, we have put everyone on mute. If you're hearing audio over both your computer speakers and over the phone, you can hang up the phone and listen via the computer only. Or you can turn off your computer and listen through the phone. Please keep in mind that you will need to turn your computer speakers back on for any videos that our presenters will be showing. I also would like to remind everyone that we are recording this webinar. Thank you again for joining us today for Building Accessibility to Address Cognitive Impairments. Our speakers today are Rich Schwartzfager and Lisa Seaman. Rich is the CTO Accessibility for IBM Software, as well as an IBM Distinguished Engineer and Master Inventor. Rich participates in numerous W3C standards efforts, including HTML5, WAY ARIA, SVG, and INDY-UI, and serves as a board member of knowability.org. Lisa is currently the facilitator of the Cognitive and Learning Disabilities Accessibility Task Force of the W3C. She also works as a research accessibility engineer for IBM and has been an invited expert for the W3C since 1999. We are delighted to have Rich and Lisa with us today. Thank you both for doing the webinar for us today. I'll go ahead and turn things over to them.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. This is Lisa. I'm assuming that most of the people in the call have quite a good understanding of accessibility. I recognize some of the names, I know quite a lot of you have very good knowledge. And I'm assuming there's a bit of background on cognitive disabilities, but not so much. And I hope by the end you'll understand, have quite a good background about cognitive disabilities and the impact that can have in web accessibility, understand the issues, and at the end, hopefully know what's happening and coming next in the profession and in the field, and what can be expected both in the short term and the long term in terms of accommodation. In case we have some visually impaired users, we have used in the slide deck some word art, but we've repeated and described them in the notes. So I know it doesn't work always as reliably in every platform, so it should all be available. So the Cognitive and Learning Disabilities Accessibility Task Force, COGA for short. And our mission is to improve web accessibility for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. I just want to say a sentence how I personally define accessibility. And you can see if you agree. It's a tricky field because it's unlike visually impaired. Everyone needs to have some cognition to understand web content. So when can something be considered inaccessible to people with cognitive disabilities? And the way I would define it is if people could understand and use your content, but they can't. So theoretically they could, but in practice they can't, solely because of the design choices of the content author, of what you've picked, to how you've decided to display the content, then that content is inaccessible. So if you've got content that someone can't understand, and they can't understand it, however you present it, then I wouldn't say that's inaccessible. But if people could understand it, but you've put barriers and increase the cognitive load to make it impossible, then for these users, then it becomes inaccessible. And often you've just made it harder for lots of other people as well. You've probably decreased the usability, but it becomes inaccessible when there are groups who now they can't use it. And so that's how we define accessibility in this context. So a little bit about who we are. We're a task force. We're part of 2 working groups inside the way of the W3C, the Web Accessibility Initiative of WCC. The first parent group, if you like, is WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. They make the ubiquitous web standards for accessibility that I'm sure everyone on this call has heard of. There's another group that we have 2 parents. We're also part of a second group that some of you may not have heard of, equally influential, called the Protocols and Formats Working Group, also part of the Web Accessibility Initiative. And what they make specifications like ARIA, and they also review and integrate with other specifications like HTML or CSS, make sure that the architecture of the web supports accessibility. So WCAG might say, fill in the alt tag, but the Protocols and Formats group is responsible for making sure there is an alt tag attribute available in HTML5, and no one thought of depreciating it. So it's kind of architectural. And that enables us to solve things in a different way. It's not just we can look at what specifications exist now, but we can think a bit bigger and think, well, if we could add to ARIA, if we could add to HTML5, then what could we do for personalization and accessibility for cognitive and learning disabilities? So it gives us a lot more strength to solve things in a way that actually makes it easier for the author, because instead of making lots of different content or being restricted in what you could write, sometimes we could solve things through having better semantics available. So our efforts, there's a lot of research looking into different disabilities. We sampled 8 very diverse cognitive disabilities and identify what the issues are that they're facing, and a lot about what happens with these specific disabilities, and then look at what could be done from a web infrastructure and make a gap analysis, identify the gaps between what can be done now and what could be done if we improve things, and then propose techniques and guidance for content providers, what people can actually do, as well as user agents or middleware or other places as well. And reviewing existing techniques and building new techniques, mainly for WCAG when necessary and when that's helpful. So the first thing I said we were trying to do is give people a bit of background in cognitive and learning disabilities. The term, by the way, they're both very ambiguous. I have to apologize for the long term cognitive and learning, but learning disabilities means one thing in America and another thing in Europe, and cognitive disabilities also have slightly different meanings. So this way we actually called all the disabilities we're referring to in both continents, and in Australian, it seems to pretty much have been the only term we could actually all be meaning the same thing. The first group maybe that we've looked at is kind of school-type learning disabilities. I would say the main characteristics is they're extremely localized. So they're things that the brain will struggle with, and then there are other things that they will have no problem with whatsoever. They'll start with dyslexia. See, I'm heavily dyslexic. There are a bunch of different, there are about 5 different subgroups of dyslexia, which I'm honoured to have all. Auditory discrimination can be very weak. They all result in a difficulty in learning to read, and that's so you've got otherwise children that you would have certain expectations that they'd be good at learning to read, but for some reason they start school and they're lousy at it, and they can't, and they've turned 8 and they still haven't managed the ABCs, and you've got no idea why, because they're clearly trying. They're dyslexic. That's typically the profile. But what's actually causing it on cognitive level, they're different things. One can be very poor auditory discrimination skills. Another, for instance, could be visual memory disability. I'll give you an example of that. When most people on this call close their eyes, they can normally picture, say, the word and I can't do that. I don't have a really good or functioning visual memory. So you can, so that actually is a good example of something that can affect accessibility, because if you expect me to copy over a 2-step authentication code that's quite long for my cell phone to my computer, and I don't have a visual memory, and I have very poor auditory memory. I'm good at it for ideas, but not just for the sound. It's going to be very hard for me to copy them over, and I may try 3 times, and then the offsite will block me out. And that's a great example of making something inaccessible. Probably everybody hates these codes, but I can't use it. So that's an example of how you could have made something that was accessible, completely usable by me, but you've done something, and now I can't use it. And you may have decreased usability for other people, but you've made it inaccessible for some groups. And obviously, someone, say, with dementia wouldn't be able to use it either, because their memory is severely impaired. So, I mean, depending what type of dementia, but that would be a typical generalization. So everything that I say here is on cognitive and learning disabilities. It's going to be generalization. Another example is dyscalculia, which is almost the opposite of dyslexia, if you like. People with dyscalculia could be very bright, highly functional, but the part of the brain that works with abstract mathematical concepts doesn't work. Pretty much doesn't work, or is highly impaired. So if you say something like, oh, 90% of people will like this, they don't know what 90% is. They could be a professor of English literature, but they will struggle with that 90%. If you'd have to say something like almost all, which would mean something for them, much easier for them to understand. Much harder, perhaps, for someone with autism who's good at numbers. So that might be more confusing for them, which is another issue. Attention deficit disorder is the last one in this category. Attention deficit disorder is inappropriate attention. So you may be easily distracted, or it may be very hard for you to be distracted if you're really engrossed in something. But don't think that attention is only affected by attention deficit disorder. It's in mild cognitive impairments, it's in dementia. It occurs in lots of different disabilities. It's very localized in attention deficit disorder, but it can occur all over the place. Then we're going to maybe more pronounced disabilities. Autism, it's a very interesting disability. It's quite complicated, but normally I'd say it's differences in social interaction, verbal, non-verbal communication, and behavioral. And that kind of social unwritten rules are very difficult to understand, as is inferences or anything that's not precise. So if someone's quite high functioning, and you say, almost, or what do you mean? Do you mean 90% or do you mean 99.9%? It's very the ambiguities are very confusing for them, and that also actually leads into another group, which affects other people as well, obviously, of people with who don't have verbal communication or very weak language skills. An example of an intellectual disability that we've looked at, being headed by Deborah Rue, I'm sure that's who you know, is Down syndrome, which is it's an intellectual disability, and typically a low IQ. But interestingly enough, often an excellent visual memory. So, got different things happening for different people. Things that are associated with age, dementia is a very prevalent and growing disability. One of the first things to go is short-term memory, working memory, but the others, problem-solving skills can also go down. Well, I'll talk about the other one that's kind of related, mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. You can think of it as an early stage dementia, but not everyone, or a lot of people with MCI do not go on to have dementia. They just have a quite a strong case of an age-appropriate forgetfulness, where learning new things and committing new things to memory, such as where you put the car keys or what this symbol means, becomes very, very tricky. So it affects a lot more people than dementia, but it's less severe. And I'd like to comment on two overlaps, which at least at this phase is out of our scope. One is emotional disabilities. People have suffered from, say, depression or anxiety. It's often harder to maintain attention, and it's often harder to remember things and learn new things. So that's something that we're finding that we're helping, and I'm sure once, if we get to manage to look at these conditions in more detail, we'll think of other things we could do to help. But already there's a big overlap. And another example is, I'm going to call them situational disabilities. In other words, I'm driving, so I can't focus. Or I'm, and so let's say you're driving and your GPS application tells you to turn left and then interrupts you with an advert. And then you'll turn right, especially if you're dyslexic. But, that kind of interruption will make anybody act as if they have a short attention span, that kind of situation. And that's going to be so important moving forward, because if we can make things work better for these groups, we're also making wearables work better. We're making, someone can't read very well because they're running at the same time. So, and for people who are often fine, but right now they're deeply anxious, things work less well. That enabling people to use content even if it's a bad time. That's another example. So we're going to be solving and giving people tools to address a whole wide spectrum of inclusion, which has been quite exciting. So how do these disabilities affect content? Well, I gave you an example of memory in copying over codes. But, if you have a weak short-term memory, or weak working memory, or weak visual memory, it's going to affect learning what these symbol sets are, and then remembering it next time you come back to the site. Good example is that hamburger menu, those 3 lines popular now, mobile, put your mouse over it. And first time, you don't know what it is, but if you have a decent memory next time, if you figured it out once, you hope you'll remember it for next time, if your memory is good. But if someone has dementia, they won't figure it out next time. And someone might have shown it to them once, but then you have to show it to them again. And something that's interesting that we're having here is you have people with Down syndrome, and you've shown it to them once, if they've learned it, they will probably remember it because their skills increase as they get older and learn more skills. But with someone with dementia, going in the other direction. So just because you've taught it to them doesn't mean next week they'll remember it. And that's important for all kinds of things. Jargon, for instance. You've explained a term in the paragraph above. If it was a difficult acronym to remember, they may not know what it is further down. And that's something really potentially tricky with user interface components. Designers like to experiment with new interface symbols and components, and they may have inconsistent interface components, and very hard to remember what they are. And what's familiar for one person isn't familiar for another. The idea is to reduce the cognitive load. So we don't want people to be putting effort into learning your interface. We want them to understand your core content. So the more complicated the interface is, the less they're going to be able to achieve in it. And if their whole focus is on the interface, then you can forget them understanding the content. But what's familiar for one person can be unfamiliar for another, and that's why we're looking at personalization a lot here, because that would enable people to have their fun with their interface design, but also keep it usable for different groups who will have trouble learning the new interface. Familiarity with symbols, and that obviously is going to include math symbols, especially with dyscalculia. And all these problems will affect people's ability to read and understand text. And there's a lot that you can do that makes it easier on people. Attention span, we mentioned. Problem solving. So lots of these disabilities affect people's ability to solve problems, such as dementia is a very good example, where at some point problem solving becomes very effective. And then again, think of that hamburger menu, those 3 lines that people are using that you put your mouse over and then options pop up. That's a real problem-solving thing. You were looking for how you can change your settings, you don't see it, you assume it's there somewhere, so you move things around and you try this and you solve the problem and you found your settings. Well, that could be a lot of fun for some people, but it's going to lose other people. And lastly, computation. So in calculations that need to be done in people's heads, you provide the tool, and that's quite an easy one to solve. So moving on to the next slide, and this is why it's so important. I mean, because you could say, I'm sorry, but my application isn't usable for people with dementia, and sorry. But web technology has become ubiquitous for how we interact with society and how we make friends and how we socialize, and invitations to events via Facebook or WhatsApp and news and banking. And all these web applications that are available, if we're not making them accessible, we're barring people from being able to survive independently. And the Web of Things is another example of where things that weren't web interfaces now starting to become interfaces, like TVs and heating control system. My father has Alzheimer's, and he got a new TV set a couple of years ago. It was quite early stage, but the TV came with three big remote controls, and that meant he couldn't change the channel anymore. So it's set on the BBC, and that's all he can watch. And if he wants to change the channel, he'll ask someone, and we put a big sticker next to the button that was for on and off. And that might not seem so serious, but the same thing has happened now with his heating, the control of his heating. He can't manage his heating because it's got one of these ICT interfaces. And that's a big deal. He would be able to, the old-fashioned on-off button and a dial that raises the temperature, but it's not. And that's a really important thing. If you can't turn the heating up and down, you need a caregiver, pretty much there full time. So he needed a lot more in the way of help because of these kind of interfaces, being able to turn the TV on, being able to use the heating, being able to use a microwave. That was earlier, but still, he lost that skill earlier than needed. And so if you think about not just the cost to human dignity, but the cost across the board to the country and society of having to provide extra help because we're not, and extra caregivers because we're not providing accessibility. It's a huge cost, and it's also in human terms, making people vulnerable when they didn't need to. It's a great example of something being inaccessible because of control, because of cognitive disabilities. He could manage the dial. He can't manage this new interface, and so he can't use it. And now we've got voice systems going to voice over IP, so they're starting to fall into our scope, and we've got many systems that make it too complicated to make a doctor's appointment or to call for help. And that's just another example of where we're taking something people could manage and making it into something that people sometimes can't manage.
Okay. All right. So quite often, this is Rich, quite often what happens is people ask me, what's the business case for doing different types of accessibility? And so let's just look at some numbers. And this really is about, accessibility compliance today only addresses a fraction of the disability market. And here's some examples. So school-age children, school-age learning disabled and cognitively disabled people are between 6.3 and 11% of the disability market. Aging, it's common for 65 or older to have mild cognitive impairments. By 2030, the plus 65 in the U.S. will be 19%, more than double in 2000. Japan, Italy, and Spain, the plus 65s will be approximately a third or over by 2050. Most of the world's wealth is controlled by the mature market, and this market has a number of cognitive impaired issues, which Lisa has discussed some of them. So usability also significantly decreases with age. Anxiety or depression at some point is roughly 18% of the market. In contrast, declared disabilities that we've been dealing with today represent 0.4% of the market. So we're accessibility professionals, and you have to ask yourself, what have we been doing for the last few years? And these numbers even get bigger. So between, this is from the National Institute of Health, between 2010 and 2050, the number of older persons in less developed countries are expected to grow by 250%. And this is 71% for developed countries. And real quick, I'm going to put up a poll, cognitive versus physical. And I would like the people to vote on this quickly, if you can see that. Okay, well, a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, and the answer is over 40 to 50 times as many cognitively disabled, at least 16 to 20%, 1% physically disabled is 0.4. So it's the second bullet. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back to the slide for people. Okay. Just quick. Okay. So next slide is here. All right. So here are some real numbers. You know, we've always been talking about accessibility compliance, but we really need to look at what's the opportunity for business. So in most of the businesses today that I see in the enterprise, we focus on the millenniums. We don't focus on the mature market. So the mature market is an underserviced $7.1 trillion growth market. The 401k plans at the end of 2016 are projected to go to cash flow negative, and that's because people are either exiting the job market or they're making a job change. This IRA market constitutes most of this this money. It's a significant business opportunity. The mature market dominates 119 out of 123 packaged goods categories, and it holds 70% of the disposable income. Millenniums, they have $5,689 more debt than their parents at the same age. The mature market purchases 62.5% of new cars, whereas the average wealth of millenniums is about $10,400. And the mature market purchases 80% of luxury travel, and the millenniums are considered the cheapest generation. All right, so 35% of online transactions are lost purely on the low success rate of online tests, and this is because the usability for the mature market is poor enough that they walk away from transactions. But we focus most of our usability testing on the millennium market. All right. So the number 65 plus to be online is to grow roughly 9% annually. And so I want you to stop for a second. Let's just think about why are we seeing some of these numbers. And I'm going to compare when I started at IBM, which wasn't my first job. You know, when I started at IBM, I didn't pay a dime for healthcare. It was completely free. And if you all sit back and think about what you have to pay for healthcare in your jobs today, and this is, start taking that off of your income. When I started, we actually had pensions. Well, those are almost non-existent today. And now you start thinking, I have to save all that money for retirement. Okay? And then you, on top of that, for a lot of the jobs, especially in the computer field, so let's say a job's going to start at about $80,000 a year. To get that, you probably are going to need an advanced degree. And a lot of these students are coming out of school with $120,000 in debt. And that's why you see companies like Uber doing so well, because a lot of the millennium generation just can't afford to get cars. And that's just a sad reality of the situation. Yet we ignore this larger market. Okay. And so I have a second poll question here. If you can answer this, that'd be great. Okay, so I'm going to stop the poll in the interest of time. So the majority got that right. It's 80%. That is absolutely true. So, okay, so I'm going to move back to this presentation. And let's see. Okay, so addressing these issues will create growth and change in the business place. Despite all the work we have done on accessibility, we've only scratched the surface. There's growth opportunity for business that creates motivation for accessibility versus litigation. And if anybody works in the enterprise, it's a tough sell quite often because, they're always asking, why do you need to go do these things? But in reality, we're talking about some significant numbers here in business opportunities. Success, though, means moving to an automatic, context-aware, personalized experience. It requires a fundamental change in how we approach design. It requires the web to be more personalized and context-aware. And it requires us to industrialize hardened solutions for cognitive. Fuzzy research won't fly. Okay? And the next slide is really important. So why haven't we really gotten to address the cognitive disabilities? Well, okay, I just finished a project with a number of my colleagues for the National Institute of Disability Research. And what we found is most of the research that was out there was behind a paywall. You have to pay $70 for this research. And quite often you don't know if it's any good. All right? And because of that, we really didn't address personalization on the web, I believe. Okay, so WCAG today is currently one size fits all. Well, for cognitive and learning impairments, actually for all disabilities, you really need to adapt the user interface to meet your needs. You can't just have, dyslexia, for example, covers a lot of different types of dyslexia, and different solutions are required in the personalization experience. Also, when you look at mobile devices, you create a whole collection of situations that ends up you being a situationally impaired user that has cognitive, vision, hearing, all different types of disabilities. So also really important is accessibility today is about content only. Okay, so the compliance criteria has been driven by declared disabilities and litigation. It hasn't really been done for this broader undeclared market. Okay, so and by that, if you're an aging person, you're quite often you'll walk away from a transaction. You won't want to admit you have an impairment. We have a lot of aging parents. We know what that's like quite often. We forget things and whatnot. So this is not uncommon, but we need to grow awareness of this. We need to build techniques drafts that are prescriptive, and Lisa talked about some of the challenges in doing that earlier. We need to create an extension for WCAG 2. We have to develop different personalization and adaptation strategies, from user preferences to media queries, to a whole collection of these things. We'll cover them more later. So issues are much more beyond content, things such as content. It has to go to things like security, and I'll talk about that later. So what we're doing is the Cognitive Accessibility Working Group is doing the research. And as part of the research, we're going to build a roadmap that includes standards, tools, browsers, operating system changes, and more. So we're bringing it up to a higher level for people. Okay. And there's some indications that change is already underway. Right now, we're starting to expose user interface settings in media queries. Like, for example, in WebKit today, inverted color settings on an iOS device or on the Mac are actually exposed in a media query. There's a new grant out now that's roughly worth about $20 million from U.S. Federal, and it's to support the new global public inclusive infrastructure. That's starting to come out of research, and we're looking to actually build that and harden that solution. Education is moving towards personalized assessment, and I know people have heard about APIP, but that's one of the things that's going on today in the IMS Global Learning Consortium. We've established the Cognitive Accessibility Task Force, finally. Web speech is coming today, and that's really important for the mature market, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. But it's there to support, it's now currently in WebKit and Blink-based browsers such as Safari and Google Chrome, and we're looking at January. We're going to start seeing this coming out. It's out in betas now, but we should be out and finalizing Firefox in the first quarter of next year. So before we go on, I'd like to pause a second and ask if anybody has any questions. I see Ron is typing.
Rich, there is one question from Andrea in the chat. She's wondering if the research source for the statistics you quoted is available.
I knew somebody was going to ask that. Well, I can get you. I can give you a whole list of the statistics, but I can give you one I have actually right. Give me 1 second. This is the one I talked about the 250% growth. Here's one here. We can make that available to people. Yes, we can do that. I don't have it here handy, but there's one.
What we could do is we have in the task force at the end you'll see a link to our to our homepage, and we have a wiki, and we could make a page off that wiki. That would be a very good idea. If someone can remind me later to do that, and then anyone looking into these kinds of numbers and trying to make the business case will have all that available. That's a very good idea. Thank you, Andrea.
We'll work with.
I think it's,
Yeah.
so I think it's back to me.
We actually have
There was one more question about was it open source? So yes, Firefox, Chrome, and WebKit are all open source browsers, and they're implemented. And so, like for Windows, you would talk to like the SAML on Windows platforms. On other systems, you'd talk to other APIs. But the API implementation itself is open source in those browsers. Okay. And I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks. So our mission is to improve web accessibility for these groups. What we've been doing is background research, and then we've been looking at issues such as for these different user groups, such as security, safety. That's leading to gap analysis and a roadmap, which in turn leads to different types of techniques that we can then make a techniques document that summarizes what a web author can just do, and you can just follow those techniques. That in turn can lead to, or will lead to, a WCAG 2.0 extension. And we're going to try and make it as easy for authors as possible. So integrating what we can into HTML5 and a YARI extension that enables adaptive interfaces, so that adding semantics can make it a lot easier as opposed to redesigning content. There's a hexagon on the other side of the screen, and that's really talking through what we're going to go through. We're working on this techniques document now, having finished the initial research phase. And the first thing are techniques that actually make it generally more usable, the accessibility issues for some and the usability issues for others. So that's kind of just nice techniques everyone can use. And then sometimes what's good for one group is bad for the other. And that's where we need semantics for adaptive interfaces. So we're kind of going to go through what's coming with that as well.
Lisa.
Sorry, yes.
Lisa, sorry. Is there any way you can speak up or turn up your volume just a little bit? We're having a little hard time hearing you. Perfect, thank you.
Okay, is that better?
Oh, much better. Thank you so much.
Okay. So the semantics for adaptive interfaces will enable you to do things for different user groups with different needs. That's going to need preferences so that we can interact with what the user needs. There's specific issues we have to look at, such as security, and all these things need to be integrated. And when we've got that, we'll actually have a solution for accessibility for cognitive on the web. And I'm going to finish off with just going over what people can expect as deliverables in the short term and in the long term, so that so that you can know what's coming and what to look out for and what you can advise your clients. So we're going to start with examples of techniques that are actually good for almost everybody. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen and the right-hand side of the screen have almost exactly the same information, but one side has it as a list with a heading and a bold, and the other side is just one long paragraph. And most people find it much easier to digest when content has been divided into manageable chunks with one idea per screen, one subject per screen, one idea per paragraph, and uses short sentences. All these techniques you can find on the link at the bottom, which is our techniques document. You can review them and see what's coming soon. The next example is to use color and presentation using symbols to show structure or the grouping of content and relationships. So in this example, we've got one color and a big font for main headings, and then a slightly smaller font and a different color for a subheading. If you think about and then we've got groupings of content. We've like call-out boxes. If you think about your textbooks that they have now in schools, they often have call-out boxes with key points or call-out boxes with tools. They'll often have an icon. And the reason they do that is it's been proven, it's been shown that this will help people understand the content. So you have a child, the low attention span, they can quickly go to the key point, and they'll only read all that long text if they didn't understand the key points. And that really helps people focus. And the symbols help people, they guide the eye and help people identify what's what with the different call-out boxes. And it's been shown to help. So if you're a teacher, you're going to use the book, the textbook that helps your students understand content. So we've kind of borrowed some techniques from there that kind of clear styles help reinforce the content, the kind of structures that are good in general accessibility, but to reinforce that with visual clues as well. Another example that is good for almost everybody, use clear and simple language. Now the challenge with that is how can we let developers know exactly what they need to do? Be clear and to the point. That sounds very nice, we all agree, but how and what and how do I know when I've done enough? So we're trying to make it as give clear instructions on what to do, and where possible to encourage testing tools and things like that. So for instance, using a common word instead of a less common or harder to understand phrase or avoiding the jargon that people aren't familiar with. And this could be a very nice authoring tool. Whenever you've got a phrase such as, in the event of, that could be in pink, and you put your mouse over and there's an alternative suggestion such as if. So whenever you've got the word in the event of, you could probably replace it with the word if. Now sometimes you can't because it doesn't mean exactly the same thing, but often if is actually clearer. Giving instructions clearly. So we're trying to be prescriptive, so don't miss out steps. How can you tell if you've missed out a step? Well, imagine someone saying to you after a step, well, what else should I don't understand what exactly to do, what exactly should I do now? And you might break that step into 3 things, then you missed out some steps. You might just want to put it inside a help icon or something like that, or as a sub-menu, a sub-indented list of steps, but don't miss them out. Make sure that they are provided. Another very clear thing to do is active voicing. Active voicing is when the subject of the sentence is the person doing the action. So, for instance, the girl washed the dog. The girl, being the subject, did the action of washing the dog. The opposite would be passive voicing, which would be the dog, who's inactive, was washed by the girl. that tends to be harder to understand. There are times you might actually want it. So, for instance, the sentence "the procedures were somehow misinterpreted." That's vague on purpose because it's more polite. There might be times that you want to use it, but we would have some technique for that, and avoiding double negatives. Another example, and you can always go to the. I've got to kind of speed things up, so you can go see these in more detail in the techniques document link that we gave. But in the next example, we've got use clear visual affordances, use clear visual signs of what things are and what they do. So on the top, we've got some buttons, next, previous, main menu, and end. At the bottom, we've got the same things, but they're not buttons. So the web design is just assuming that people are going to look at it and think, oh yes, if I click on it, it will go to the next one. But it's much more obvious when it's a button. So if you can imagine someone with dementia trying to use the two different presentations, when it says next and it's in a button, they'll know to click on it. But when it's just the word, they won't know. And if you put your mouse, here between the word next and previous, if it's a button, you can see clearly what's going to get clicked. And if you put it and it's just text, you're not sure what's going to happen, and often it's not what you think it is. And that's very confusing when people get disorientated. Another example is help users complete and check their work. And so I'm having to gloss over it, but don't lose people's data when they went to get a coffee because they needed a break, or because they needed to double check what they're doing. Preventing errors, so accepting different types of formats. For instance, if someone puts in the date box the 8th of September and writes the word September, they may have been writing checks like that for the last 60 years. So you can say, no, we need a different, you can give them an error, or you could just have a better script that accepts this formatting, instead of making them do it with all the different numbers. And then in Europe, the numbers are in a different order, and they're liable to get it wrong. So you can actually parse the content and have a better script that will just accept the different formats that they used. Another really important one is to make it very easy to undo mistakes. So if people go back and check their work and see they made a typo, or they actually ordered 2 instead of 1, they can go back and change it, and then they can go forward, and they don't have to redo, enter things that were correct. That's one thing that can make it easier. Another thing is clickable breadcrumbs that give a summary of each step so you can check what you've done. There are many more examples, but I'll move on in the interest of time. Just give a feeling maybe of what kind of things we're coming up with as general techniques. Providing help, content-sensitive help, what these things are. Putting tooltips on icons if you don't also have text, or on any jargon, speech supports and API supports, as well as making it easy to get human help if people need additional support. Make it easy to get that support and not too convoluted. And a lot of this can be done through personalization that will make it much easier for people and provide the content-sensitive help without the author having to do much. So this might all look quite difficult, but it actually we're doing our best to find ways to make it much easier.
Okay.
Rich.
Okay. So real quick, let's take a look at attention issues. So when you're designing, you want to avoid distracting elements like blinking and scrolling. We need to avoid anything that would cause interruptions. You want to help the user with their focus. Lisa gave an example earlier of grouping things with icons, but you definitely want to have things grouped properly to help manage the information And also, it's really important for you to be consistent with your user experience. Don't move things around if you can do that. And so, just real quick on interruptions. We talk about people that have declared, may have a declared cognitive disability around attention deficit, but this happens to everybody. I mean, if you're using a mobile phone, how many times are you interrupted while you're on your phone? If you're in a meeting during the day, and we've all experienced this, we're listening to a presentation like this webinar, and somebody pings you, you lose your context, and then you need to go back. So it's really important to understand that you have to, it's kind of like security today. You can't just prevent people from getting in the door. You have to assume that the issue is already in the door, and you have to figure out how to remediate the issue. So things that you can do, and just take a look at this meeting. If someone interrupted you, you can go back to the meeting and you can see the transcription running. You can, if they ask you a question, you can see where the discussion left off, and you can have a better shot of actually answering the question. But other things that you can do are providing breadcrumbs. If you get interrupted, you have to come back to say you're taking a driving online course because you got a speeding ticket. You want to know where you left off. You need to, other things that you can do are provide things like reminders. People with attention deficit need to have help organizing things. So providing reminders, calendars, things like that as part of user experience are also very important. Okay, so we're going to move on to slide 18. I'm trying to move it a little faster so we can get through everything. And this is really about multimodal access. And I'm going to start with the next poll question. I think this is it. Okay. Multimodal access for digital math, keyboard-driven highlighting and speech improves comprehension by 10 to 15% for students with Okay, can't see how many people have voted, but we got the percentage in there. So I'm going to end the poll. That's absolutely correct. So today we did a study at NIDR on inclusive access, and this is a real number, yet we don't put digital math out to students today. I mean, a lot of the browsers don't support MathML. And we don't provide this different types of highlighting-driven user interface. And why aren't we doing this? Imagine if we can improve math comprehension across the board in worldwide by 10 to 15%. That's a pretty powerful statement. Okay, so regarding multimodal access, so examples of this are highlighting and speaking for text. This is important for learning disabilities such as dyslexia. Keyboard-driven highlight and speech for digital math, we talked about that. Touch to speak. So we actually deployed a solution called Easy Web Browser in Tokyo for the aging population, and one of the most popular features is to be able to touch something on the screen and get an audio rendering of that particular text. It helped people get access to information. These were at kiosks in Tokyo. Tokyo, and actually all of Japan, is a very large mature population. So these types of things, being able to put those features in our web applications, for example, can really improve the usability of our product for specific users. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is enable adaptability. All right, so one of the things that we're going to be doing, and we've identified in the research, is the need to be able to provide metadata on content to drive the user interface. So, we talk about an ARIA today, and I chair the ARIA task force. Up to date, till today, most of what we do in ARIA has been driven largely to support interoperability with assistive technologies, but it actually has cross-cutting benefits for people. So what we want to do is when you have things like widgets, like a button, we want to tell you what the function of that button is. And we can use the semantics to drive the user experience. So this actually saves a lot of time. If the author can put in the intent into the content, we can style the user interface to look a certain way. So for some users, actually for all users, we might want the help or the undo button to appear at the same place in the page and give it the same style rather than changing it when we go to page. This is really user-driven personalization, and so being able to know what the help function looks like and all the time, not just how it's styled, but where it appears is important. Importance levels is also essential because we might want to do things like, for a particular user, let's say in HTML5, we say the default native semantics is to for the main element it's a high important item, and maybe we always put that first. Maybe we'll filter things out. You see some of this, is even though it's not quite implied in Facebook today, that what they'll do is on some screens, you won't, if you turn your iPad a certain way, you won't see all the people who are live on messaging because your real estate is important and you want to show that it's not as important as the mainstream of content on Facebook. So that's really important. If we can go in and really put the semantics in, it will save a lot of time and it will address a lot more people. And I give you an example of header of the main content, but we could do the same thing where header has an importance level and banner of medium, so they would come afterwards in the user interface, or we might filter them out altogether, depending on the situation. But these are the types of things that we can do when we develop applications today. And what I see quite often today, which is silly, developers will add the ARIA afterwards instead of at the beginning and use that to drive your user experience. They could save so much if they use these types of semantics early on in the user interface, because you can use them to drive styling and have you. All right, next. Somebody's blowing into the microphone.
So I've just put it on a different setting, so hopefully I'll be louder now. If I'm less clear, please put it in the chat, and hopefully I'll see it.
Okay. Lisa, you're on.
While we're paused just for a minute, I just want to remind you all that you have about 30 minutes, okay?
Thank you.
Oh, my. No. So that we're talking about semantics for adaptive interfaces because what's familiar, we want to make things familiar for the user, and the icons are familiar from, say, a person who's with MCI, an older user who's been using Apple devices for a long time, maybe different from someone from a different country who's used to Windows. So the adaptive interfaces really allow a much better user experience. But they're not going to work unless we actually know something about the user as well, and that's the semantics for preferences. So we need the different pieces working together. We need a web page with these ARIA semantics. We need personalization settings that can be stored securely on the user and can all be adapted at the user end. Or securely on the cloud. And open source script is our first implementation that we're putting together to enable people to just pull in something that works. So I'm going to try and share my screen and show you the open source project on GitHub that's being done to create a script that can read a personalization file. The author doesn't write the personalization file. That's settings from the user. It's like a skin. You can start off with one skin or another skin, and adapts the page based on what they're reading as user settings. So here we've got a clothes shop with online clothes shop demo, and it doesn't exactly make my heart sing, but I can use it. They've used the term main instead of home, which I can figure out what it means, but other people might not. It doesn't have symbols. It's got quite a long form. But, sorry?
We're not seeing your screen. It says share my screen. Do you want to share it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
There you go.
Okay. Is it showing the screen now?
It's spinning.
I'm sorry, I pressed the thing and there was the other thing to press. Tell me when it's happy.
Lisa, do you have you might have a message that you have to download the add-in, the Adobe Connect add-in.
No, I think it's saying it's got a stop sharing thing, so we're hopefully good.
We're seeing it now.
So here's the page, right? This is the GitHub project that people can see. And here's like the main, instead of saying home, but I can figure it out, lots of buttons. It's a contact us page. It's got the submit button and the reset button, which often means that my message will get, I often use it wrong, but other people might like it. Often it wipes the content for me. And lots of options and things that some people will want. They'll want to have all the options available when they first go, but it's got, extra content that other people might not like. Now, this project is going to read the personalization file. I'll show you an example of that's the web page, and you can see you've got ARIA function, which says that thing that was word main has the given function, and it's got importance set. And it also imports a script. That's really all. Now, you could actually copy and paste the script, and then you can change it if there's some effect that you don't like, so the author stays in control. And here is what would be a JSON personalization settings belonging to the user, where it has information how to handle certain functions and how to handle different importance levels. So let's see what happens in this demo when I read in, which would happen automatically. So you get the preferred format. The word main has been changed to home, which is something I understand. You can see here and here, sitemap and home. These are known functions.
Lisa, I'm sorry. I'm going to pause for a minute. Annette, can you hear me? If you could just restart the caption. Probably working on it.
It's got rid of some of the extra content, and the button that I find, the reset button that always makes me lose content, is gone. So you've got some more symbols. And so I would find this more usable. Other people may find it less usable. But here is a second very similar skin, which only is showing your three main, options, cutting out, only showing our importance of high, which tends to be stuff that 90% of users will want, and that's how we've defined it. And this is actually something that my father could use, who has Alzheimer's. It doesn't have that many options. It's not that overwhelming, and the symbols are helpful. So, and it's all the same page, so it's being adapted on the fly. So I'm going to go back to the thing here. I need to stop sharing. Sorry. I don't. The stop sharing thing seems to have disappeared.
Can you do it? Lisa, can you see the PowerPoint up?
I can see it, but it's grayed under.
You might have an icon thing up to it. There it goes. The caption has been disconnected.
Okay. There we go. I'm back. Good. So it's back to the PowerPoint. So there's the JSON. And what hopefully you've noticed is that we're managing to provide content sensitive help, and the tooltips and the clear layout, all through the JSON at the user end. So the user may say what they want for extra content-sensitive help, or an access key that's always used for this function. So wherever you are, you press Control F and your work is saved. And so you've got this content that's being provided through the personalization skins, because we can make a bunch of them and you could cascade them and get the real tailored effect without putting so much burden on the author. So we do what we can to make the author burden as low as possible. And so we'll put together the pieces, the ARIA, which is what the author needs to add, the open source script and the personalization setting, and get the strong, tailored user extension. And I think, Rich, I'm handing it back to you.
One second. Do we have to do anything for anything to get the? I'm concerned the transcript isn't going. Is that an alternative? Oh, cool. All right. So there's a link in there to get the streaming text, I'm hoping. Okay. So the ARIA Koga module. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating common functional task attributes. We talked about those a little bit earlier. We're going to define standard importance levels, and we're going to use the semantics to drive the user interface presentation based on personal needs and preferences. So those things can include, but it's not limited to, prioritized orders, what types of icons are being rendered, how you rendered help support, consistent styling of content, not just how it looks, but also the placement on the screen is very important. And also the ability to hide less important content to simplify it. All right. One example that I know that frustrates, I've seen this happen before, is you're typically used to seeing the sitemap to the bottom of the page, and then somebody takes it and moves it to the top. That's really, for me, that's rather annoying, but it does happen. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the semantics for adaptive interfaces. That's on the next slide. But what I want to do is I want to give you the concept of context adaptation. All right. So when we talk about delivery context, this is really where it starts to become mainstream for all users. So you have your main user preferences, but there are also preferences that change while you're operating the application. So, you know, we think about things like volume control. We might want to change where something is positioned. We might want to turn off things that interrupt you all the time. For example, I might want to temporarily turn off the chat list of who's on in Facebook. I might want to do that temporarily, just not permanently. Device and environmental context information. So, for example, I'm using my mobile device. I go into a noisy room, and I can't hear the video I'm watching any longer. That's a real frustrating thing. So if your device could then say, look, I need captions turned on now, it doesn't matter why you need them. The fact that you've turned them on could result in a user interface that is much more usable automatically without you having to do anything. So to do that, you need know something about the resource capabilities. Okay, you know, can it support captions? There's an alternative resource needed, and how do you marry that with device capabilities? So here we go. So those things coming together allow us to make intelligent decisions on how a user interface can be generated. The next thing I want to talk quickly about is specific issues that the working group has focused on, and I'm going to focus mostly on security for my part. So some of the issue papers that they really had to drill down into are security and privacy technologies, voice menu systems, online payments, flat design. You see a lot of that in iOS 7. online safety, user preferences, adaptable links and buttons, the web of things, a whole collection of those particular issues that the group focused on. I'm going to talk briefly about security because this, we talk about content, but this actually goes beyond just the content. So some of the complexities that we have to deal with security actually prevent people from accessing a system at all. A good example of this is I can't possibly remember all those passwords. When you deal with things like CAPTCHAs, there's so many steps in the process of handling CAPTCHAs that you get lost and you walk away from accessing the system altogether. One of the things we need to do is make this easier to gain secure access to systems. And what we want to do is prevent things, which often happens with the aging population, is I can't remember all those passwords. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick something really simple like my wife's name and use that for a password across all of my systems. And now this wealthier generation is exposed to security issues and identity theft. So the things that are happening today is we're looking at biometrics, key tokens delivered through a USB or near-field communication readers. This is actually going on today in the global public inclusive infrastructure. It makes it easier. You walk up to the system, you can wave your authentication card to the system, and the user interface automatically adapts. But, we may have different authentication preferences for different users. Maybe they want to have long passwords. But these are things that go beyond web content. And, this is part of the work that the task force is doing, is focusing on each of these different issues.
Annette, if you can hear me, if you can work to get the captions back, I'm not seeing them yet. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Rich.
Okay. I'm looking at Glenn's comment here, and I think it depends. I actually think, to some degree, we're going to be going towards user-driven styling of user interfaces. But what you would have to do, the designer would need to plan for all of these different types of settings when they do the user interface. So it is more challenging, for sure, but you would be addressing a broader range of people. Thanks for the point, Glenn. Okay, so I'm going to go on to VoiceML and give that turn over to Lisa.
Hi. Yeah, so just on VoiceML very quickly, the voice over IP telephony, these things are now becoming more and more on the web as well, bringing all their accessibility issues into our scope. And I'm sure we've all been annoyed by these kind of phone-type menu systems where it says, press 1 for primary services, 2 for secondary services, 3 for billing for primary services, and 4 for, and you don't know what to press. While you're trying to figure it out, they say, we didn't understand, so goodbye. And sometimes you have critical services like medical appointments that are being booked on these kind of systems. There's a lot that you can do by just, using clearer, easy to understand words, such as instead of secondary services, it could be for internet and data services. You can pause and then say, press 4. So the person doesn't have to hold on to the word 4 whilst they're figuring out if it's the right service. But the most important thing, I think, which is a catch-all, is using the reserved digit 0 for being able to get to a human. And I think there will be pushback from industry because they don't want to have receptionists. But you could add a waiting time or something that people can always press 1 and go back to the menu system for a faster service. But I think it's essential if a service is critical that people can use it even if they're finding the system too hard to navigate, and that they can get help. Another example is metadata. Sometimes you actually have alternative content. instead of having adaptable content, you might have 3, 4, 5 different versions of the same content. This typically happens with essential content. I remember in Israel last year, they made content for what to do if there's a siren. And the content for the simple language content had different advice. So the mainstream would be wait 10 minutes in the shelter, but the simple language would be think of a song that you like and sing it 4 times. If it was a short song or you're fasting, sing it 2 more times. And that advice it's different advice, but it enables more people to understand and stay safe. So what we need is people to be able to find the right content for that. It's not going to be a widely used solution, but it will sometimes be used on critical content, and we need people to be able to find it. And for that, we need metadata at the top of the page that can say, A, what features this has, this page. This is a simplified content, what length of vocabulary you may need, and also if there are other alternatives available, so that automatically, based on the user preferences, the right version can be found for the right person. So as you can see, we have to integrate all these pieces, look at the issues, and put them all together. So we have to think about text-to-speech support, security, and then we also have to think about what's the semantics we need to enable that. That's not going to be enough. We also need personalization, the user preferences to be encoded, and a script that can activate, or other mechanisms that can work on the page to adapt the content to, as the personalization suggests. We'd like these preferences to be portable over different clouds and different devices, so that's another piece, as is the metadata. But we're going to put them all together and coordinate them so we get a really good user experience. And finally, the roadmap that I promised you, and what to expect coming short-term and long-term. So the first thing we did, as you know, is user research looking in a different, for 8 sample disabilities, and performed a gap analysis. That's going to result in creation of author techniques and some standards, and those will be out short-term, I think 3 months to a year. We should be getting working drafts of these things. They won't necessarily be full standards in that time, but we will be getting out working drafts. And we also will need examples and supporting materials so that people can really understand what we meant. Things that are going to take a little bit longer are things like preferences. So when I say longer term, I'm thinking about a year to 3 years. So at the cusp of a year, hopefully we'll have finished the preferences standard and have some early implementations, and integrate that with other standards. We've got to think about what advice we want to offer middleware and user agents, and browsers and operating systems, and it all has to work together, as well as suggestions for tooling for authors and conformance testing, and things like that. And then also, is there advice that we need to give and guidance we need to give user agents? Once we've done all that, we may want to go back to the research phase, because there may be new issues, the web's always changing, where there are groups we haven't looked at. Maybe there are groups that still find that there's content that's conforming to all this, but they can't use. Different disability groups maybe will take a look at emotional disabilities more seriously, and start with the phase 2. So that's what you can expect in the short term and the long term. And if you want to take a look at what we're doing, we've got some links here to our task force if people feel they would like to join. And we've also got an interest list if people want to comment on any of the deliverables that they've seen. And all our information is also out on the wiki, which I can send on. And the techniques draft and the issue papers links are also inside the presentation. And I think we're ready for questions. We have a full 5 minutes.
We can take just a couple more questions, and then we're going to have to conclude. Does anyone have one or two last questions? No?
There was a debate I saw in the chat. Someone's raised their hand. Sorry.
All right. Looks like we're going to. It looks like we're going to actually
Did
have
someone
to.
raise their hand?
David looks like he's going to type.
So, do you want to unmute two of the people who raised their hands?
Hi. I think I just realized, did I just unmute now?
No,
You're on mute. You're not muted. We can hear you.
Okay, good. Phew. This is Judith Blankman, and I just had a recent issue with a layout that I was seeing on a project that, someone asked me to review for just, testing, UAT kind of stuff. And content that I work for Wells Fargo, so we have really good writers and people that understand interface and layout and keep things really simple. But still, I felt compelled to say something because they were presenting this information in 2 columns side by side. And even though it was chunked into small paragraphs and lists and whatever, I just felt like 2 columns of information side by side created cognitive load. And I was just wondering, so this isn't something as complex as having an interface with a million things on it and or things flashing or, the crazy stuff, but I still felt compelled to say something. So I was wondering, and so I kind of dug up every resource I could about cognitive issues, and I couldn't really see there was a WCAG, requirement to measure against, but I just needed the use case of, the person, the need. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about things like that, like side-by-side kinds of layouts, and whether those have any issues that, whether those should be avoided, I guess, or lengthy side-by-side. Not. Anyways, that's my question.
I saw them discuss, hi, this is Lisa. I saw them discuss in one of the simple language government content, but that was for written text. I haven't seen any strong research on web content that's a problem, but I have seen it suggested in the government plain language and simple language for written text, that people finding multiple columns harder to digest. But certainly good use of white space is important.
Yeah, and there is that. I mean, it isn't a decent design. It's just I found it personally hard to read, and I felt like that's a litmus test that if I'm finding it hard to read, someone with cognitive issues probably would too. So.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. We actually need to conclude today's webinar. Before we go, I just want to go ahead and thank Rich and Lisa one more time. Thank you guys so much for a lovely webinar. And thanks to Annette Blau for doing our captioning for us. Just a quick reminder, our IAAP Access Conference is coming up. Our early bird deadline ends this Friday. Lisa is actually our general session speaker. And so if you want to check her out, make sure to come to the conference. You can register for that online. Just wanted to let everybody know that after this webinar concludes, I will send out an email with a link to our feedback survey. You will also get a link to the archive of today's webinar and the transcript as well as the chat log from this webinar. We will also open an IAAP Connections community for those of you who are members and want to continue this conversation. Rich and Lisa will definitely be on there to answer more of your questions there. So if you want to exit, you can just click the X out at the top, and thanks again, everyone.
Sharon, do we send you the links for the resources that we had for the statistics?
You can send them to me and copy Natalie, and we'll get that out to everybody in the post-webinar email.
Okay.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone.